COVID, as Maffei's paper on Uber drivers shows, was considered by many as a kind of hot shop event for mobilizing workers. And what I have done in this research is looking at two union initiatives that came out of the COVID pandemic. One was the establishment of the emergency worker organizing committees, which was a kind of a joint alliance from the Electrical Workers Union in the United States. The Bernie Sanders campaign donated money, but also a link up with the Democratic Socialists of America. And then second is the New York State HERO Act, which was passed in 2021. And it was a coalition of unions and labor activists. And there's two aspects to this law. The first that mandates airborne infectious disease plans in all workplaces. And then the second, which I'm going to talk more about, is the mandating of the establishment of independent worker health and safety committees in all workplaces with over 10 employees. And so the empirical basis of this project is 28 interviews that I conducted 2022, 2023. Okay, so basically what I'm trying to argue is that while these are different paths, both EWOC and HERO are aimed at translating COVID mobilizing into worker organizing. So that is, it's clear that, you know, many workers felt a sense of injustice and aggrievement from their treatment during the pandemic by employers. So I have three central questions that are sort of driving my research. One is, how did unions involved in EWOC and HERO use their power resources, so engaging with the power resources approach, to enhance those of workers mobilized by the COVID pandemic? And how, and indeed did, workers use, especially their associational powers, to act upon these resources by organizing? And third, and finally, what do these cases reveal about the insights and limits of the union power resources approach? So I think most people in this room are pretty familiar with the PRA approach, obviously been perhaps one of the most influential in terms of understanding union power and worker power more generally. I include structural power, both within the workplace, but also the labor market, institutional legal power. There's been a big list that's been generated. Associational power can also include financial resources. But there's been a growing critique, often an auto-critique by its own practitioners, that first of all, the PRA relies too much on kind of crude measures of power like union density, and then reads off from that what workers can or cannot do at the level of, say, a workplace or organizational campaign. And that it misrepresents institutions as power in themselves, as opposed to just power configurations that are only sources of leverage rather than power in themselves. Okay. And then finally, and in particular, I think I want to focus more on in this paper, is that the micro-macro links between these power resources and what actually goes on in discrete workplaces needs to be more actively addressed. So recently, Romberg and Lopez have really argued that it's associational power, the ability to act on power resources, that's really the key. And I would argue that this also intersects with some of the work of John Kelly, especially the amendment made by Holgate in 2018, where they argue that, you know, Kelly is, you know, he deals with power in his 1998 book, but not necessarily the power resources approach. He's more looking at that subjective level, especially at the workplace. So that mobilizing is the utilization of power resources already available, whereas organizing asks where the power is that is needed to affect change. So especially there's this emphasis in Holgate and Kelly on the role of leaders in acting upon these resources, in particular at micro-scale conjunctures for framing of worker sense of injustice to promote organizing and change. Okay, so I want to give you a little bit more background about EWOC. So the United Electrical Workers have a long tradition of militancy in the United States. They often organize outside of the National Labor Relations Act in terms of really, you know, about issues of power in particular. As far as they're concerned with EWOC, they have a sort of arm's length relationship on the governance board, but they've provided a lot of training, a lot of experienced organizers work, as we'll see, with the volunteers. They've also provided some financial resources. The DSA, Democratic Socialists of America, provided a network of young, very ideologically committed volunteers. So basically the way the EWOC model works is that workers contact EWalk, okay? And it was initially just a Zoom-based model, okay? Obviously for the pandemic. Now it's kind of transitioning into a kind of a dual mode, like both Zoom and face-to-face. So obviously, you know, Zoom has been really important in the sense it gave workers them access to many different workplaces. As we'll see, they don't have tremendous numbers of volunteers, so they have to try to maximize their ability to access people. And you know, everybody was sort of Zoom literate by the end of the pandemic, where they had access to that kind of technology. And so if you look at their ongoing efforts, they approximately have 250 volunteers, mostly from the DSA. As I said, they get paired with a skilled organizer. There's a lot of training provided to them. So initially they had between 100 and 150 contacts a month, that is workers contacting them. By 2023, there were up to 300 monthly, and that was really ascribed to the SAG strike and the ongoing UAW strikes. That there was this big upsurge in workers really interested in what they call either campaigns. So they have about 300 campaigns, and a campaign isn't necessarily union organizing. It can be about raising wages, conditions, and so forth. But they'd had 29 successful unionization campaigns, including in rock climbing gyms in Brooklyn, and there's some really interesting stories I was able to capture. And they had 13 ongoing. So that was about a year ago. I don't have some updates on that. So one of the things that they try to do is make workers aware of their legal power. So many workers aren't even aware that they're allowed to, and for example, have the right to association, much less to organize. So one of the things is just like making people that you can do something and you can act upon it. And so they often use and deploy the McAlevey deep organizing. So by identifying leaders, mapping workplaces, inoculating workers against employer retaliation, which is a really big issue, and when and where possible, putting them in contact for unions for organizing. Not necessarily UE, it can be any union. So as the organizer said to me, it takes 100 steps to get to your first contract. EWalk moves you through steps 1 to 50, which a lot of staff organizers don't have the time to do. But it's also this longer term project that is, it's about building seeds for the future. The real success are by building relationships with workers who genuinely develop organizing skills so that they're empowered. So let's look at the HERO Act. So the HERO Act was a product of demonstrations, lobbying by a coalition called Align, based in New York City area. And so they're using this associational power in order to get this law passed. So as I said, there's two aspects to it. One is this airborne disease plan that gets put into place as soon as the governor declares a health emergency, okay? But they have to have a plan, the employers have to have a plan. But for activists, the key provision is this independent worker-led health and safety committees, especially in non-union smaller establishments and workers in outsourced networks. It also mandates it in unionized workplaces, but there's some interesting issues there as well. Now, the people I interviewed said that they thought that, so it's like a form of proto-unionization, or potentially. This law, HERO, is the greatest labor organizing law I have ever seen. It was a game changer. So these are the things that people were saying to me about the nature of this law. So the idea here was to use associational powers to act upon the law, to move from mobilizing to organizing. So once workers start working collectively to build power and make changes in their workplace, the scope of what's possible is expanded. So one example that I found was some New York City construction workers, mostly from Central America. They formed a committee in 2022-23, but it took 3 or 4 months to get the employer to accept that. So what happens is that the employers or the employees write a letter to the employer. The employer has 10 days to respond. If they don't respond, they start to get daily fines. Not very big fines, but there are fines, right? But they really had to agitate in order to get this. So what was interesting is that the committee is now also acting as a proto-union in the sense they're negotiating not just health and safety, but wages, conditions, and benefits, was exactly the way some of the practitioners have it. Now, I don't know whether this is going to work, and excuse me for using Elon Musk's here, but So a very uplifting tale there. So it took 3 months. The question then is this constituting mobilizing to organizing? So there are particular challenges that these organizations are confronting. So many workers are relatively structural workplace challenges. They are small workplaces, retail, fast food, some graduate student, some healthcare working organization. That doesn't mean they don't have any structural power at the workplace, but they don't have what, like big logistics centers might have. Also, EWOC is a kind of strategically passive organization that relies on people to contact it. It's not like a union that goes out to try to organize. And also, it was very clear that some of the DSA volunteers were very middle class, very college educated, and it took a lot of work with them to be able to talk to people who were not of that background. The kind of language they might use was actually considered somewhat alienating to people who are not quote unquote woke, as was pointed out to me. And also what they found was that many workers relied on their post-COVID structural labor market power. That is, they just would leave rather than to organize. And EWOC was saying, don't leave, try to organize. But it was obviously very easy for people to find another job. So there was also these challenges, how to scale up, going from just workplace campaigns to industry ones. And also there was a skewing of a lot of the where they were successful. The great majority of contacts did not lead to any kind of campaign or unionization. Often workers were still unaware of their associational rights, or they didn't feel comfortable even acting upon them, right? I'll just try to go as fast as possible here. HERO, on the other hand, there's been very little really state enforcement of the law, and many people have no idea in New York State that this law even exists. It doesn't really have any of those micro mechanisms that EWOC has to translate this unless you get like a worker center working with you. And in fact, the only case I found where this committee was founded was the one that I just showed you. Okay, and so that was like 2 years into that. And also employers are capable of resisting, even in unionized workplaces, the formation of these committees. That was something that came very clear. What we also found was that union institutional and legal power actually could work against organizing. So that New York State is a very highly unionized state, but it's arguably the unions are too comfortable with the Democratic Party in many cases, or the unions aren't willing or able to actually cope with the numbers of people who want organizing in New York. So towards some conclusions, I realize I'm running over time. So we could see that unions drew upon their legal and institutional and associational powers. In some conjunctures, they're able to act, workers able to act on these powers to move from mobilizing to organizing, but EWOC had these stronger micro levers. HERO really lacks legal enforcement and the ability and willingness of unions to act. So we have all sorts of challenges in terms of insufficient awareness, employer power still being very strong, and so people aren't really as able to move from mobilization to actual organizing. So structural legal powers matter, but power is conjunctural. We can't really know a priori how it actually is going to get deployed and whether it's even relevant. The key is whether we can mobilize workers through associational power, the workplace scale. But we can't just sort of say associational power is simply the what I would call the magic bullet here. It's not an independent variable. It's part of a dialectical of powers. So legal and institutional powers matter and there's a lot of real intervention required. Finally, it's very clear that unions actually possess considerable financial resources, like over $30 billion in resources. They're either unable or unwilling to invest in more organizing. Okay.
Dancing girl.
Okay. Or the gong. Okay. So what we find in the United States is that many unions are waiting to get more legal and institutional power, like the PRO Act, but rather than acting upon existing or around existing laws to leverage worker and associational power to promote new laws. Okay.